I think Games Workshop have snuck some new lore into these short stories to expand on at a later date.
Sneaky, sneaky soy sauce.
But don't take my suspicions as gospel, have a listen and let me know what you think about these new units which could even find their way into the tabletop game. You're probably aware there's recently been a few Space Marine short stories released, and some of these very much fleshed out fan favourite chapters, such as the Raptors, provided us a lore update, as is the case for the Executioner's Penitent Crusade, and even introduced a whole new breed of corrupted Astartes. And no, I'm not speaking about Chaos Primaris. But if you are interested in the newest lore about Chaos Primaris or a tyranny-killing weapon, then check out our last upload here, where we've compressed those two novels into one video.
Shamelessly plug yourself.
So you want to learn some new lore, hey? Buckle up and let's explore the newest lore in 40k. Executioners and the Arkifane's Astartes. We're going to begin with my own favourite chapter, the Executioners. But listen carefully, because we're about to hear about a new unit I reckon will even come to the game. One of the most badass characters during the Horus Heresy was actually founder for the Executioners chapter. That is Fafnir Ran, Dawn's own seneschal, Sigismund's best mate, and captain of the Imperial Fist 1st Assault Cader. Ran waded into battle with a pair of power axes, so you know the chapter descending from his teachings is going to be ruthless and capable. I think if Fafnir could see the Executioners now, he'd be extremely proud, because they embody Dawn's seneschal completely. Their chapter culture is one of absolute honour, but this is actually what got them into trouble in the first place, with the entire chapter being sentenced to a century-long penance by a court of their peers for their part in the Badab War. You see, about 2 millennia prior to the infamous civil war sparked by Luft Huron, the Executioners chapter was besieged by the ancient xenos menace known as the Sloth. And to understand how terrifyingly capable the Sloth are, there are ancient writings connecting the Rangdan to the Sloth, the latter suspected as being some type of overlord to the race which nearly brought the Imperium to its knees. Fortunately for the Executioners as a whole, the Astral Claws came to their aid, with both sides suffering tremendous casualties. Not only were Ran's successors almost wiped out, approximately 300 remaining, but many of the Astral Claws fell to the terrifyingly effective Sloth weaponry, including their chapter master. An oath was sworn by the Executioners that should the Astral Claws ever require their assistance, they'd be there in a heartbeat. And so you can perhaps understand why, when a seemingly loyalist Huron sent for aid, the Executioners answered, even though doing so was risky at best. Of course, we know the Imperium emerged victorious over the secessionists in the Badab War. However, the Executioners, due to their unswerving code of honour, were vouched for by the Salamanders themselves, and so were sentenced to a century-long penitent crusade rather than excommunication, such as the Astral Claws come Red Corsairs would endure. Now, this preamble was important, and you're about to hear why. You see, the reason the Salamanders vouched for the Executioners at the conclusion of the Badab War was due to their conduct during a Salamander's surrender to Executioner's High Chaplain Thulsa Kane. The Executioners had bested the Salamanders in void combat, however offered Vulcan's sons safe passage from the war zone should they swear not to take part in the various conflicts of the Badab War moving forward. During this ceasefire, whilst Executioner Astartes were on board the Salamander's battle barge accepting terms, a small team of Astral Claws secretly boarded the vessel, seizing the Salamander's gene stocks and slaughtering any of Vulcan's sons who attempted to bar their exit. This eagerness to raid Salamander gene stores would be the undoing of all Astral Claws within the Badab War. However, as High Chaplain Thulsa Kane then discovered the true heretical nature of their so-called allies, these few Astral Claws present would experience firsthand the true wrath capable of being dished out by Ran's successors. For, incensed by this betrayal, Thulsa Kane and his battle brothers would butcher not only those Astral Claws who violated their terms, but every Space Marine, Servitor, and Serf aboard the neighbouring Astral Claws vessel, with Thulsa Kane throwing the decapitated head of their leader and Arch Centurion at the Salamander's feet before withdrawing themselves. Within the new short story Tally of Slaughter, it is said a handful of astral claws escaped this hour of slaughter, a small retcon to established Badab War lore, though these corrupted Astartes chose not to follow a defeated Huron Blackheart into exile within the Maelstrom, or pledge their souls to one of the Greater Four. No, this small group, calling themselves Ushmangar, instead elected to worship an altogether different warp entity, Vashtorr The Arkifane. There's a fascinating passage early on in Tally of Slaughter which begins to depict the corrupt power which these Astartes have been imbued with. When the executioner's version of a chaplain, called instead a Death Speaker, lashes out at the lead Ushmangar with his Crozius, the passage reads, "The Chaos Space Marine cocked its head to one side, eyes boring into Razel's. When the Death Speaker was within reach, it nodded and spread its arms wide. The executioner swung his Crozius. The fractal form of the heretic Astartes shivered as Sharur connected with it. There was the roar of a vast furnace underscored by the shriek of overtaxed bellows, the clanking of gears and the hammering of pistons, and the Ushmangar vanished like smoke blown in the wind, leaving only a chorus of trailing screams." But of course that's not all. In the Tally of Slaughter, the executioners have interrupted the Ushmangar during a ritual in which they intend to gift a Mechanicus Forge Temple to their patron. They have secured the Forge Temple, corrupting any surviving Skitarii on board, and are subsequently in the process of opening a portal on board through to the Arkifane's own Soul Forges. The Ushmangar are described as wearing spiked plate and being all but silent during battle, perhaps even very methodical, which reminded me somewhat of Thousand Sons Rubric Marines. Again, whilst the High Chaplain Razel wrestles with one of these Ushmangar, this short passage describes these newest variety of corrupted Astartes. Burst fire from the executioner's pistol stitched an arc across his helmet, which cracked, exposing his metallic face beneath. The delineation between the organic and inorganic had become blurred to the extent that they had become one and the same. Oil bled from ruined armour and unclean flesh metal. Once the small executioner's task force battle their way to where the lead traitor named Kaleg is performing his ritual to open a causeway into Vashtorr's otherworldly forge, within the pulsing storm was Kaleg. Molten metal was siphoned off the blast furnaces, forming fiery wheels into an armillary sphere spinning around the floating Ushmangar. The Skitarii shrieked in Binaric as they were lifted from the raised walkways, torn towards the eye of the churning storm. They were disassembled, their flesh withering into ash, whilst their bionics melded into the spinning rings upon which bleeding eyes had formed. As Kaleg moved towards Razel and Igikura, a forge vault vast beyond imagining spread out behind him, the hellish vision overlapping the reality of the Manufactorum. There was the roar of colossal furnaces, the heave and gasp of monumental bellows, and the clang of countless hammers, thudding pistons, and clanking gears, underpinned by the screaming of tortured souls fueling the forges. I really enjoy this description of a more almost industrial type of warp sorcery, not to mention the description of Vashtorr's supernatural forge-like hellscape. Since Vashtorr's introduction during the Arcs of Omen campaign, he's had a hand to play in a collection of high-profile conflicts, though these were more or less in cahoots with the despoiler. To see his own subjects here was a real treat for me, as somebody who thoroughly enjoys the ruinous powers. We experience more of this corruption in this passage. Whereas Kaleg's form had been ephemeral before, a charcoal sketch jumping in and out of focus, now it was wholly corporeal. His armour was burnt black, running with unclean oils and unguents. Mechadendrites writhed from between the plates like fungal growths, straining for some dire unity with the emergent demonic mechanism. Around him were the rings of the armillary sphere, which were both armour and a mechanism to unravel reality, spinning faster until they were a blur as the warpsmith approached them. Kaleg, whose attention had been thoroughly upon Igikura, glanced at him, his quasar-like gaze boring into Razel's own. A high-pitched screech preceded the obliteration of Razel's helm display. His armour felt heavier. The fibre bundle muscles tensed and servos halted, keeping him upright. These descriptions paint a picture of corrupted Astartes who have given themselves wholly to Vashtorr the Arkifane, metallic-like skin coated in glistening oil, not to mention mechadendrites straining from underneath power-armoured plate. On certain other YouTube channels there's been talk of Dark Mechanicum and Vashtorr receiving some love in the near future. I'd really enjoy seeing more of this corrupted mechanical lore, or even models. Would you enjoy reading about that, or even starting an army? Let me know in the comments so I can see how many people are interested in that type of lore. But of course, Tally of Slaughter isn't simply a spotlight on Vashtorr. The short story takes place not long following the Executioner's Penitent Crusade, where it's detailed upon the Crusade fleet's return to their twin recruitment worlds of Stygia and Aquilon. A torchbearer fleet was waiting for them, of course, with a host of Primaris to replenish the Executioner's ranks. So thankfully, if not in a slightly ham-fisted Mary Sue type explanation, the Executioners are thankfully fully operational as a chapter once more. And now I could be misinterpreting this next part incorrectly, but I'm fairly certain that an epistolary is the only Astartes among the chapter who's still considered firstborn, with Crusade veterans crossing the Rubicon and the first generation of Primaris recruits from Stygia Aquilon active in the role of intercessor. Again, that could be me misinterpreting a portion of the novel, and if you do own an Executioner's miniature collection, don't at all let that put you off using them, even if you're a die-hard lore fanatic. You could still use them as Crusade veterans who stayed behind to scout deep portions of unpatrolled space, or something along that type of narrative. Let your imagination be the limit, not a passage from a short story. Before we jump into the Raptors and Angels Vermillion, keep in mind that a simple like, sub and comment may not mean a whole lot to you sometimes, but it means the world to people like me who create and post content. With each interaction you choose to do with our videos, YouTube's algorithm shares our content with an even wider audience again. So I just want to say a massive thank you to everybody who takes a moment to show their love back. It honestly means so much. Lore for the Raptors and Angels Vermillion is certainly kept to a minimum compared to the Executioner story.
That sucks.
But I've done the best I can to extract anything remotely resembling new or updated lore that's been slipped in, giving us all a greater understanding on how these two chapters are operating inside the era Indomitus. The Raptors have found a place in many a 40k hobbyist and lore enthusiast heart due to the more realistic way their chapter operates. That is, in the way an organised military force would, avoiding casualties, making use of proper tactics outside of headlong charges and a colourful clash of heraldry,
Heresy!
and above all else, their famed utilisation of camouflage. It's mentioned early on in the story that the chapter's strength has been spread very thin. Nothing new there, given most chapters are in the same situation. However, the Raptors have been tasked with protecting the fragile interstellar supply lines which deliver rations and other vital material to the millions of troopers taking place in the Indomitus Crusade. That is a truly vast, not to mention complex network to protect. And so the Raptors, being so short on manpower, have deployed a single squad of 6 Astartes to rescue an entire world, doing battle with Drukhari raiders who've recently made sport of many Imperial citizens, torturing them unto the brink of death, drawing both joy and vitality from the suffering they inflict. Whilst investigating the source of tortured screams emitting from a barn beyond, an obvious trap, the Raptors must bear the anguished screams of the citizenry within. I found this quite interesting that the Raptors, a chapter which seems quite pragmatic, were affected so by the suffering of baseline humans. Because whilst not all Space Marines are numb to the plight of humanity, often fighting in the defence of an Imperium rather than to save a paltry few people, if you'd have asked me to name a few chapters which actually give a damn about the little guy, I wouldn't have said Raptors, so that was interesting. I also particularly liked this line. He spun back towards the doorway, opening the squad-wide vox. He had realised what Kashok had not, that these tortured colonists had been used as bait. Yamata had seen, had used, terror tactics of all kinds in his years of service. He knew a trap when he was in its jaws. For me, considering an Astartes chapter who was so much more realistic, I guess, in their approach to warfare, not to mention the barely conceivable feats each Space Marine is capable of, these bioengineered superweapons utilizing terror tactics in the name of the Imperium really got the cogs of my imagination turning. Unlike the almost garish methods utilized by, say, Night Lords or Drukhari, I assume the Raptors' approach to torture as part of a wider tactic would be very emotionally detached and methodical, applied to elicit an exact response from the enemy. One final point I'll mention is that during combat, the Raptors are very logical and extremely calculating, running calculations on several scenarios when faced with unforeseen variables during deployment. A little bit in the way Ultramarines are described during the Heresy series, but, dare I say, at a far greater pace in the heat of battle. Angels Vermillion. Now when it comes to the Angels Vermillion short story titled The Blooded, the first thing I want to touch on actually isn't about any Space Marine, and it's this line here. Varys looked through the magnoculars at the designated impact area 600 yards to the front as the landscape was being reduced to fire and ash. Artillery was nothing if not destructive. With or without the Emperor's protection, Varys knew this day would surely be won with firepower, precision, and the ability to hold the contents of your bowels firmly in place. I'll pray for the Emperor when my last rifle has run out of power and everyone else around me is dead. This was Sergeant Varys Ulka of the 51st Kievan Armoured Infantry Regiment, and it's a sentiment shared by a spreading multitude of humanity in this new dark age, as we discussed in this video. Faith in the Emperor is waning in the masses. But enough of that mortal stuff. Now, if you weren't aware, the Angels Vermillion are actually a successor of the Blood Angels. However, unlike the vast majority of sanguineous lineage, these Marines shun contact with their brother chapters of the same gene heritage. Perhaps part of the reason could be the Angels Vermillion's secretive practice called the Sorrowing. This is a ritual wherein select humans are painlessly put to death in order to siphon their blood, which is then used as nourishment during battle. This technique has been utilized by the Angels Vermillion for millennia, holding the Red Thirst at bay. You have to understand though that this isn't as barbarous as it may sound, because compared to other chapters afflicted with the same curse, such as the Flesh Tearers, who may, at barely a moment's notice, tear into ally or civilian alike, the Sorrowing ensures this does not occur among their number. When blood is drawn during battle, adrenaline spikes and sanguineous sons instinctually hunger for blood. So having a pre-made brew ready to feed this urge isn't a terrible idea, though obviously there exist mortals who pay the ultimate price. Other than knowing this process is done in a humane manner, the mortal dead even being honoured among the chapter, there's very little else known. I especially liked this passage from The Blooded. It follows the aforementioned Varys rescue by members of the Angels Vermillion from Death Guard Astartes. Varys, surviving 2 squadmates, were quickly, perhaps humanely, executed by the Angels due to being infected by one Nurgle disease or another. Before I read this, just know that the Astartes called Malev is a sanguinary priest who has a calming effect on those around him, just like his daddy did. The baseline human Varys turned to look back. He seemed confused, shocked, unsure. The sight of other baseline humans in the Thunderhawk, stripped of their weapons and equipment, caused him to hesitate. Iterus pointed towards the steps and a bemused Varys nodded and then hurried over to the others. A mix of men and women, there were more than 30 of them. All were afraid until Malev spoke. "Valiant champions of the Imperium," he began, "your journey begins today. Our enemies are countless and their methods relentless, but with your honour-bound service, we can oppose and defeat them. Some of our enemies kill with rusted blades, some kill with words, seduction, or the love of violence. All are death, all are dishonour. But we offer you fortitude. We offer you the immortality of the Sorrowing. The flight will be hard upon you, but rest now, for glory awaits you." Malev turned and took his place next to Iterus. The void harness lowered and clamped onto the Space Marine's armour with a clunk. Iterus looked over. Honor, valiant champions, he whispered. Malev stared at Iterus for a moment. His eyes seemed to drill directly into Iterus' soul. You and I will never know fear, Iterus. We fight beyond its reach. But these soldiers were gripped by it, and all endured. You may think them cattle, but they fight far harder than we. They face that fear every day, and for that we honor them, and we remember them. I'm glad that there's still a grim dark aspect to the Angels' continued existence. It doesn't matter how kind you are, you're still taking the lives of innocents, heroes even. Our next 2 video releases, as voted by our Patreons, will be a deep dive into the World Eaters, and I'll weigh in with my thoughts on the idealism as well as modern day social conflicts making themselves at home in our beloved hobby, and who, most of all, needs protecting from it. So keep your eyes peeled and subscribe so you don't miss out. I'm looking forward to hammering some home truths that a lot of people probably don't want to hear. Of course, a massive thank you goes to our beloved Warlord Titan supporter on Patreon, Nelson. Not only is Nelson a huge support for the channel, but he's also a skilled hobbyist over on our Discord. What a legend. Just follow the Patreon link in our description to take a look at what you'll receive in each tier. Voting for content and suggesting video topics is one of the perks of joining for as little as $2 dues. Thank you so much for tuning in. Why not share the video in a Facebook, Discord or Reddit group? Get Titan Wargaming's name out there. Until next time, take it easy and have a good one.